Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. I'm sure other people will just filter in as they do, but let's make a start now. Okay, so today we're looking at, still looking at individual differences, but as you'll see, it's also at the same time as looking at individual differences, we're looking at effective factors as well in second language acquisition. And a lot of those effective factors have to do with personality. So today we're going to focus in on two kind of very broad individual differences across learners. So language aptitude and personality. I wanted to fit in a bunch of other individual differences, some of which are listed in your required reading for this week. But it was simply impossible to fit in a meaningful amount of content into this lecture. So I might not finish today, but the intention of this lecture is to give you kind of a walking tour or a snapshot of both language aptitude as well as personality. So I'm going to highlight certain things. It's not going to be comprehensive. That's virtually impossible because particularly with personality, I mean, this is coming out of personality psychology, which is almost like the main form of psychology out there. It has a special place within psychology. So we'll be looking at that both generally and then more specifically as it relates to second language acquisition. Okay, so in the reading from Hummel, she differentiates between these five. We've looked at motivation and a little bit at attitudes. We'll look at attitudes more when we start looking at social factors. And today we're going to be focusing then on intelligence in relation to language aptitude. Often they're looked at together. And then also personality. Like I said, we won't be looking at learning stroke cognitive styles and learning strategies. And those maybe sound a bit similar, styles and strategies. They're quite different. Yeah, so we won't actually be, there won't be a lecture on those two ones at the bottom, but you are introduced to them in your reading for this week. Okay, so, and a lot of what follows is based on an excellent book called The Psychology of Language Learning, the second edition from 2015. So I also would just like to say a decade has passed since it was published and now. So I'm sure that there are updates to the research, to the kind of the field as a whole. So take what I'm saying with a pinch of salt. I think broadly a lot of the things will have remained the same, the findings and I guess some of the way that people theorized, for instance, the relationship between personality and second language acquisition. So, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight that at the beginning. This is not necessarily up-to-date science, but it gives you a good broad overview of where things have been relatively recently. Okay, so we'll start with language aptitude. So firstly, what is it? And you could talk about it like some people just have a knack for language. They have predisposition. They have, there's various ways of talking about it just in kind of common sense language. But I think the main reason why there is research around it is because there are just differences in the level of proficiency that people achieve, which isn't present in first language acquisition. So then there's a question, well, is it because the people who achieve the higher proficiency have some kind of language gene or some kind of aptitude that the others don't have? So that's kind of where the impetus for this as a field of inquiry of study came from. So according to Robinson, aptitude is the ability to adapt to and benefit from second language exposure, whether it's instructed, so in a classroom situation, or naturalistic, just informally through immersion. And it doesn't determine whether someone can learn a language, but it's more about kind of similar to the first point. It's the rate of progress under certain optimal conditions. So already there, I want you to start thinking, well, that's quite a few elements that need to be in place for aptitude to show itself, right? There's a speed, there's a rate of progress, and then there's these optimal conditions. Things like motivation, opportunities are obviously to get a lot of input, get a lot of interaction, output, and then if it's in a formal learning environment, quality instruction, good teaching. So all of these things kind of impact then whatever language aptitude is. Another thing which, I mean, and the citation there is from a long time ago, but the idea is that language aptitude is not a single thing. It's not a language gene that is like in your genetic structure, but it's a combination of various cognitive abilities, and maybe even not purely cognitive abilities, but there's other things that are going on, primarily cognitive though. Okay, so one of the big questions has been, well, and obviously emanating out of psychology, there's a kind of study of intelligence, what intelligence is, how to measure it. Obviously IQ tests, all these various things. That's a big kind of question in psychology. And so the question is, well, okay, if you have intelligence here and you can measure it, you can kind of get a good proxy for intelligence. How does that relate then to language aptitude? Because obviously intelligence is something far more general, whereas language aptitude is specific to second language learning or additional language learning. So there's a debate here, and there's lots of ways of trying to answer this. So some would say maybe it's just a subset of intelligence, as in you've got general intelligence, and then one part of that is language aptitude. So it's almost language aptitude derives its explanatory power for why some people learn quicker than others from the fact that they have a certain amount of intelligence, right? So that's one way of looking at it. But then that calls into question whether it can be viewed as something that is itself, or it's just one element of intelligence. But if it can influence second language learning beyond just measures of intelligence, then it seems like as a separate construct, something that's worth studying on its own, kind of in isolation from just looking at intelligence, then there is value to that. So research has shown that there is no simple correlation. The two often do correlate when you would be testing for intelligence and testing for language aptitude, but it's not straightforward. It's not like it's a one-to-one correlation. Yeah, so and part of this is because with intelligence as well, it's actually a complex of multiple different cognitive abilities that are all firing at the same time. And when you're talking about general intelligence, obviously there are certain kind of cognitive things that don't really activate when you're engaging in language learning. So yeah, there's kind of interrelationships between the various components of these two constructs, but not necessarily all of them map onto the others. And that's kind of come out, as you'll see going further into this topic, like, thanks. As we go further into the topic, you'll see that a lot of the conclusions that people have reached is that, yeah, we can't view either intelligence, but in particular language aptitude, as like a unitary construct, just one thing. It's multiple things, and it's multiple things within a complex system. So, and this kind of does challenge then, I guess, some common sense narratives of language aptitude, which is that some people have it and others don't. It's really not that simple. Okay, so yeah, I just want to kind of also contextualize some of maybe the differences between intelligence then and language aptitude. So intelligence is pretty stable over time. If you measure it when someone's very young, and then you measure it when 60 years later, and there have been some studies to this effect, it doesn't dramatically change over time. So whatever intelligence is, however you define it, and however you measure it, there are some decent measures. Still, we don't know quite what they are getting to, but however that thing is measured, when you do that same measurement later in life, there's a very high correlation between those two scores. So they're very similar, right? So intelligence seems to stick around. Yeah, so measured in childhood strongly predicts intelligence in later life. But then if we look at language aptitude, then it seems a bit different because, especially if we're thinking about first language acquisition and second language acquisition, obviously there's the critical period hypothesis, and age seems to significantly influence language learning. So adults require a high degree of aptitude to achieve native or first language-like proficiency. But that's not the case for children at all. They don't need a special dose of language aptitude to achieve high proficiency. There has been some, I think, research and focus on language aptitude for first language acquisition, because there is some differentiation between how people can acquire their first language, but the differences are marginal, they're minor. But there are pretty serious differences between adults and those who've learned after the critical period. So that's just interesting. Language aptitude is unstable in some way. So it's different to intelligence across time. It doesn't seem to stick around. And so kind of one of the questions is, well, that also suggests that these are different constructs, right? That maybe we should examine them in different ways. Okay. So one of the ways in which people have tried to almost simplify what language aptitude is, and is just saying, well, okay, so there's this thing called working memory in, I guess, neuroscience and within psychology. And in effect, trying to reduce language aptitude to working memory. And one, I should also just say, like, and as I've been kind of reacquainting myself with this literature, over time, there have been fashions within scholarship. So you would have a certain almost paradigm of how you would approach the question of language aptitude. And you would have certain assumptions during that time. And then things would stagnate. There wouldn't be as much research. People wouldn't be as interested in those questions. And then someone would come along with a good idea and say, hey, maybe this is what it is. This is the route we should go to figure this thing out. And so I can't exactly remember when working memory came into play. It might have been the mid-90s, mid-late 90s. And someone just suggested, well, actually, maybe that's really what it is. Language aptitude is just someone who has extremely good working memory. And so it does play a central role, and that's definitely kind of been shown within research. So it's the capacity for storing and processing unfamiliar sounds. So think about that for a moment. Like, if you are learning a new language and you're encountering a whole bunch of new sounds, if you have a higher capacity for remembering those sounds, that allows you almost to work with them within your cognitive faculties to maybe start deriving what the rules are behind the sounds, why the sounds, chunk together in certain ways, what the meaning of those various sounds are. You have something to work with for longer. Whereas if you have very short working memory, then it's maybe more of a struggle. So you can kind of see where this hypothesis came from. But kind of like I was saying with intelligence and language aptitude from the outset, even working memory is not a single ability. It's not like a thing. It's like the intersection of a bunch of different processes which are going on in the brain. So it's difficult even with working memory to figure out, well, what exactly is it? And then some later work has then also almost suggested that, well, okay, cool, working memory is a component maybe of language aptitude, but surely it's only relevant at certain stages of language acquisition. Because I was thinking, at later stages, when you've heard all the sounds, there's not really too much that's unfamiliar. Is working memory relevant to you as you are starting to master some of like the nuances of output, of becoming more accurate in your speech? So it doesn't seem then, for people who are very quick, say at that later advanced stage of language learning, does working memory serve to kind of specify that? And it doesn't seem like it's the case. So that's kind of maybe one critique that you could have of whether working memory is language aptitude. Okay, so I kind of made that point at the end. It's a complex thing as well. It's probably a lot simpler than language aptitude because it's, I guess, a bunch of neurological processes that are going on, but it's still itself complex, and it's difficult to kind of understand, well, if language aptitude is mostly the same thing as whatever working memory is, well, what are the things that it's not? What are the other elements then of language aptitude that add on to make someone good and quick at learning a second language? So anyway, that was kind of a bit of a deep dive into one of the ways, because working memory is often also viewed as part of intelligence as well. So you would test in some intelligence tests for how much working memory people have. So there's some commonalities between intelligence and language aptitude, but they are not identical. They're not the same thing. And I think that's been pretty broadly borne out in the literature, in the research. Okay, and another theme that keeps on coming through with language aptitude is that so much depends on the situation. So, for instance, the classroom context and how it's set up. So, for instance, the learning and the teaching methods, the pedagogical kind of methodology can influence how the learner's aptitude manifests. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but you can kind of imagine that some of the other individual differences that we're not looking at are like learning styles or cognitive styles, and then learning strategies. And you could argue that maybe some of the components of language aptitude are actually found in those other individual differences, And so if you have a certain cognitive style, or maybe you are very good at picking up on audio information, so like you'd be able to, someone can play a song and you'd be able to remember the words pretty easily. There are people who can do that, right? They can remember better than others. And maybe you could say that's working memory, but let's say that you're good at that. And then the classroom is set up in such a way where there's a lot of audible inputs that's coming all the time. It would be maybe great for some learners who have a cognitive style of learning, but maybe not for others who are more focused on, who are kind of good at the more literacy skill side of things. There's also the idea that, well, maybe what language aptitude is really, it's just the perfect combination of a whole bunch of different individual differences. So particularly the ones that are suited to efficient learning given certain situations. So, and again, this is just a slide really where I'm trying to emphasize the complexity of what it might be, because again, language learning is something that happens in context. People are not just simply brains in a vat that are just doing cognitive activity. And as a result, the idea of language aptitude, it needs to shift, because sometimes a person might be very good and very quick in doing something, maybe when they don't have any anxiety because of the context around them, but then put them in another place which is high anxiety for them, and then all their aptitude disappears, right? So, and I mean, so some people have also tried to look for instance, the perfect combination of individual differences. And you might ask, well, okay, we're going to be looking at personality after this. Well, what are some of the perfect personality elements that would make for a good and quick language learner who would have language aptitude? So that's another way of kind of trying to explain what language aptitude is. It's really just the bringing together of multiple ideal individual differences. And that's really all that language aptitude is. It's nothing in and of itself. Okay, so just a few final thoughts on this. This is kind of a conclusion. This is the way that at least Dornier and Ryan, who I'm drawing from, they concluded saying that aptitude is a complex. So it's that there's all sorts of different things. It's a complex phenomenon, but then and there's not just one kind of complex where there are multiple kind of elements of what language aptitude is. There are multiple complexes depending on the situation. So there's all to say the thing is complex. And certain individual difference variables might be more effective for learning. And one thing that's kept on coming out is that it's really only useful to actually research language aptitude. And there was a slide that I had included why people research language aptitude. And a lot of it has to do with trying to identify people. For instance, especially back in the day when with schooling, you would try and identify who's strong at certain subjects so that you can put them in like the stronger class and then the weaker class. I guess as a educational philosophy, that's largely fallen out of favor. But also a lot of actually the initial aptitude research came from, for instance, the US Army, who was trying to identify who could learn languages quickly. So that when they are doing whatever they do overseas in foreign countries, they would have people who are able to speak the languages of that place. So the US Army then invested a lot into finding techniques and instruments to measure language aptitude. So there was kind of an educational purpose behind why they were measuring it, because they wanted to figure out, well, who's going to be best suited to second language acquisition? Yeah. And so I didn't go deeply into the various forms of language aptitude testing, but there are pretty reliable predictive tools. So there are like tests that if you were to give it to everyone in this room, some people would score highly on it, some people would score probably on the lower end of the spectrum. And it's pretty like reliable if you were then to look 5 years in the future, whatever the second language or additional language was, it would probably be able to predict who has kind of achieved a higher proficiency versus who hasn't. But nonetheless, despite the fact that we have tools to measure this thing, it's still not clear what it is. And at least as of 2015, that was the conclusion that was come to. It's highly unlikely that it's maybe a bit more clear now, 10 years later, but it's unlikely that actually any firm conclusions have been reached about what it is, what it's not. And like I've been saying repeatedly, language aptitude is this kind of, it's at the intersection of multiple different elements. It's a complex. And like we looked at yesterday, motivation is very important. Also emotion. So we'll be looking at a few affective factors later in this lecture. But those things obviously have an impact then on whether aptitude is like activated in certain situations or not. So a lot of what people have been trying to do within the language aptitude space has been trying to come up with then more meaningful or broader frameworks for understanding how language aptitude interacts with these other variables, right? So, but yeah, just like a take home from that is, it would be incorrect to think that there's a language gene, that some people have language aptitude and others don't. So much is situationally dependent on all the other individual differences between people, right? Nonetheless, there is something that some people do have that others don't. A lot of it is maybe related to general intelligence, but there's also probably language-specific things. So yeah, that's kind of a broad overview of language aptitude. So for the next and remaining 20 minutes of this lecture, we're going to be looking at personality. And so this will be more of a dive into personality psychology, which maybe some of you are already aware of. You've done either in maybe educational psychology or psych itself. Anyway, there's so many definitions, I'm sure, of personality. I've got two here. Personality as one's whole character and nature. It's a very broad definition. Maybe a better one is by Pervin and John, that it represents the characteristics of the person that account for consistent patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving. And you can, just looking at those verbs there, feeling, thinking, and behaving, those pretty much account for like one's whole character and nature. Maybe it's emphasizing the behavior side as well more, but it's a very, very broad construct. Whatever personality is, it accounts for a whole lot about who people are. Okay, so, but obviously, it's also influenced by multiple different things. So it's not just kind of genetics, but like the biological factors obviously come into play. There's a tendency to pass down maybe certain personality traits through the generations, but so much also has to do with nurture, situational, environmental, cultural factors, right? And I think there's probably disagreement within the personality space of the extent to which nurture can actually affect personality, because personality is relatively fixed. Nonetheless, there are changes over time, which we'll look at. So there have been lots of different kind of models of personality really since personality emerged in the early 20th century. So people would argue that certain forms of philosophy then gave rise to the study of personality. So philosophers like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, who were very interested in, I guess, the psyche, how people think, why they think, the motivations for acting in certain ways. And then that gradually led to people like Freud and others who started almost systematizing knowledge about the psyche, sometimes in very creative ways in Freud's case and Carl Jung. But then gradually there's been a consensus that has emerged. So you might have heard of the Myers-Briggs. There's also something called the Enneagram. But increasingly, at least within the research and kind of academic side of things, people have settled on the Big Five model. And that's partly because it's borne out again and again in the statistical kind of data that there are these main 5 factors that explain most of the variance across multiple people. And what they did was they pretty much needed to find names for these 5 factors. And so we'll look at that next. It's also called the 5-factor model. There's a very convenient acronym just to remember. For those of you who haven't done this, I'm sure those of you who have, you would have encountered OCEAN. So the first trait is openness, or openness to experience. And for the O, you can see why it's called openness. There's like an imaginative nature, curious, flexible, creative, etc., etc., etc. So some will be high on this measure, others will be low. And you'll see that some of these traits really just have one name, others have a spectrum. So there's like extroversion - introversion. Some are just one thing, openness. But with all of them, you can score either high or low if you were to do a personality test using the Big Five model. Okay, so conscientiousness is the next one. High scores are systematic, meticulous, efficient, organized, reliable, responsible, hardworking, blah, 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 blah. And then the inverse for those who are low scorers. And you can see with all these are mostly adjectives. These are ways of just trying to describe how people are, right? And so what the Big Five did was they were just, well, these are the main 5 things that help describe how people tend to be, right? It's not obviously saying that everyone's like this, but individuals differ across these 5 axes, right? And I think with individual differences, it's important to make the point that like what we are looking at is not so specific that just one individual has these differences. It's things that tend to occur across different individuals. But if you were to take 2 individuals, there'd be a lot of differentiation between them. But if you were to take a whole crowd of individuals, you will see, oh, there are these similarities. This 20% fall into this kind of category, and so on and so forth. So obviously, things like personality are very much a thing that's present in everyone, and the differences there are just general differences amongst specific individuals. So again, I guess so much of what science is and research is just about navigating the almost the tension between the specific and the general. Anyway, enough philosophy of science. The next one is extroversion, introversion. So that's the E of OCEAN. And this is a very common one. It's also present in other models like the Myers-Briggs. So high scorers are sociable, gregarious. They like to hang out with lots of people. They're active, assertive, passionate, talkative. Others who are low scorers, passive, quiet, reserved, withdrawn, sober, aloof, restrained. And I should also just say, as I'm going through these, for those of you who are kind of unfamiliar with personality psychology, none of these are like value judgments on people. You might, fall at some point in the spectrum for these various traits, but there's almost always pros and cons. So if you, for instance, are high in negative emotion, or what's also been called neuroticism, doesn't sound great, but it's at the same time, it enables you to do certain things that if you were low on that same scale or opposite or high, you wouldn't then, as it were, have that way of interacting with the world. So Okay, so agreeableness is the A, and this is often associated with people who are very empathetic, or the inverse, people who are not empathetic, who are very disagreeable. So I probably fall more on the disagreeable side if you got to know me. And then the final one is neuroticism, emotional stability. And yeah, so worrying, anxious, insecure, depressed, self-conscious, moody, emotional, and unstable. Low scores are calm, relaxed, unemotional, hardy, comfortable, content, even tempered, self-satisfied. You can kind of see with a lot of them, if you were to look at these adjectives, you'd wonder, well, how much of these are kind of essential parts of who a person is? So it's like almost who you are versus who you were in a specific moment, right? So as we'll come to with anxiety in particular, and there's been a lot of research done on anxiety in language classrooms, so and how that affects then the learning process. There's kind of two ways of looking at anxiety. But we'll come to that. So just highlighting that. Okay, so some general findings, particularly in relation to learning, not specifically second language learning, is that openness to experience and conscientiousness are the most relevant traits for success in learning. So I think you can figure out why conscientiousness is. If you spend enough time doing a thing and sticking to it, even if you may be bad at it, you can eventually, it's kind of is it Aesop's fable of the hare and the tortoise, and the hare got distracted on the way, but the tortoise just kept on in the goal very slowly. So the tortoise was extremely conscientious and eventually won the race. And you can kind of see how that, obviously, I was talking yesterday about persistence in language learning, and conscientiousness would predict almost certainly persistence. Okay, so it's the strongest and most consistent predictor. And it just predicts, achievement from whether you're in preschool and whatever you're measuring there in terms of what success is at preschool level, and then at adulthood, probably in terms of kind of economic socioeconomic status, et cetera, et cetera. And then interestingly, extroversion, which obviously has other positive components, has typically a negative relationship with academic success. Partially because of some of the things that go along with being an extrovert, right? And again, just to repeat, these are general findings. They don't apply in all cases. So introverts then sometimes are better at learning. They tend to consolidate knowledge better and stay more focused. They're not as distracted by other people in their surroundings. They can. And then neuroticism often correlates negatively because of a sub-component or a sub-trait. They also call it lower order traits. There's higher order traits, which are the big five, and then there's lower order traits. And anxiety is one of the lower order traits of the neuroticism trait. But in low stress learning environments, if you are like high in that trait, it can also have a positive association with academic success. So it's so dependent on the context. Okay, so now we're going to just take a bit of a winding route in the last 10 minutes through some of these personality traits. And then also, as I mentioned at the beginning, affective factors, which often are related to personality traits. And again, it's not going to be systematic, but it'll give you a good snapshot and overview of, particularly now focused on second language learning, not just learning in general and not just personality in general. So in formal or high stress situations, and you can kind of see how this would be if you're very used to engaging with people and enjoy it. An extrovert would tend to become more fluent a lot quicker because interaction would be something that they would find really easy, right? So that's just interesting thinking about the general theories like interactionist approach. There are certain maybe personality types which then work well with certain approaches. And certain approaches then have their pedagogical implementations in classrooms. So if you're a very interactionist friendly teacher, maybe the extroverts in your classroom are going to do well, but the introverts won't, right? So you can kind of see how all of these things impact second language acquisition. So introverts, and this is, I think, from research where they've actually looked at it, they may struggle with fluency due to excessive arousal or nervous energy, that's at least my way of putting what they mean there, which disrupts the automatic processing of language and then overloads working memory. So kind of as you're trying to speak, there's this nervous energy that's almost interrupting what would happen naturally and without interruption in an extrovert. So this can sometimes mean, not always, that introverts speak slower, more hesitantly, can make more errors and produce shorter utterances because I guess they focused on other things. They're on the reaction that the situation is having on them. And then that's not allowing them to, as we were, just focus on the interaction and the communication itself. So yeah, extroverts more likely to use colloquial language freely. They often enjoy it. So in some of the research that I've done for my PhD, I was finding often that, and I didn't do enough, I think, personality like research of the participants in my study, but there were some who really just liked throwing different languages together. And if they had been learning, for instance, Xhosa, then they would just use whatever knowledge they had in various other languages, and they would throw in some English, and they'd throw in some Afrikaans. I'm specifically thinking of a German woman who learned Xhosa, and she was very like translingual. She would just put all sorts of languages together, use colloquialisms. I suspect, I didn't test for this, but she was quite high in extroversion. But then there were more introverted types who are interviewed, and they were so keen on preserving the core deep versions of language. They didn't really like the colloquialisms. They would prefer to use the proper words for things. And so you can see how, and obviously that then has impacts because to learn colloquial language almost always has to happen in interactive environments outside of classroom settings, because classroom settings tend to have curricula which are focused on formal language and not necessarily informal colloquial language. So an extrovert might get really bored and feel like, what we're learning is not relevant to how people actually speak. That might then influence the effective filter in the classroom and so on and so forth. Whereas an introvert who's like, yeah, this is actually what I want to be learning. These are the forms of language that I like, that I'm comfortable using. Okay, I need a rush. So yeah, high achieving. One study, I think I need to say about all of these findings is that overall, what's really irritating about how personality interacts with second language acquisition is that there's no real consistency. You'll have one study that will have one finding, and then another one which has the opposite finding looking at the same kind of situation. So sometimes introversion is great for language learning. It may be the intuitive side that goes along with being introverted. You're obviously more engaged in mental dialogue with yourself. And maybe that then helps you kind of intuit grammatical rules or whatever. That then correlates with being a high achieving language learner. But that doesn't necessarily mean that then you will do well in situations which are completely brand new. So if you're thrown into a new country as an introvert and you haven't yet mastered the language, so you're still in the process of learning, that might be the worst place to learn. And you might, not make much progress, whereas extrovert would excel, right? And then in terms of the language skills, that's another way we can look at how extroverts and introverts differ. Extroverts probably would focus more on speaking, maybe listening, hopefully, and then would excel at that, whereas introverts who would maybe, show the opposite pattern and do better at all the other skills. Okay, so now having looked at some of the big five kind of main traits, I want to talk a bit about effective factors. And for those of you who looked at the updated assignment briefing, I changed the language slightly to focus more on individual differences, and then I put effective factors within that, right? So, and I guess in more recent times, there's been a critique of effective factors as a way of describing the things that affect second language acquisition, because there were a whole bunch of almost popular concepts that came into the research world, academic world, and here some of them are, attitudes, motivation, anxiety, self-esteem, empathy, risk-taking, tolerance of ambiguity. And if you just look at some of those, you would think, well, what is self-esteem? Self-esteem is all sorts of things going on there. Like it could be all sorts of personality elements, all sorts of situational elements. The same thing with risk-taking, with tolerance of ambiguity. Maybe empathy is pretty much just the same thing as agreeableness. Like, is motivation also an effective factor? Sometimes motivation has nothing to do with emotion. Sorry, motivation, yeah, has nothing to do with emotion and more just to do with very pragmatic, kind of analytical necessity, reasons for doing things. Anyway, so what I would say, and this is kind of my own thought here, is that effective factors exist at the intersection of specific personality traits within specific circumstances, right? So we will talk about effective factors, but I want to kind of situate what they are in relation to personality more broadly. And it can become a bit hazardous when you think, well, there's a thing called self-esteem and it's its own thing. Actually, it's maybe a whole bunch of different things. So similar to the discussion about language aptitude, is like it's a complex of multiple different things. And a lot of the effective factors are the same. The cool thing about personality psychology, particularly the big five, is that it's almost like arrived at these main continuums between two poles. And like those things are those things, right? It's not that there's a whole bunch of other things that are then interacting with them. So there's a certain simplicity, which is like very rare actually in science, or at least in the social sciences and things relating to human beings, because we're just really complex. Okay, I'm probably have to skip. So for instance, one of them is risk-taking. It's at the intersection of openness, negative emotion, and the extroversion, introversion. And you could view it as a way to make intelligent guesses. It's maybe related to impulsivity. So some people are more impulsive than others. And you can kind of see, I want you just to imagine a more impulsive student would get into interactions more often, take more risks in terms of using language, be more willing to make mistakes. So what are the implications then for pedagogy and for success if you are more of a risk taker? And I'd probably put risk taking right at the intersection, particularly of if you're more on the extroverted scale and you are more open to experience and to new things, right? Yeah, and then I mean the inverse is true. If you're not a big risk taker, that can implications for SLA as well. So a silent student in the classroom who's unwilling to appear foolish. They don't want to take risks, which might expose them to maybe someone laughing at them or something like that. And that impacts then their willingness to communicate. That's another like big focus within SLA. And obviously, if you're willing or unwilling to communicate well, is that purely a personality thing or is it a situational thing? Again, it's kind of it's at the complex of multiple different things. Self-esteem is another. I'm not going to look at it. Okay, so language anxiety is intertwined with other effective factors like self-esteem, inhibition, risk-taking. Obviously, it's got a personality component. It's viewed as a sub-trait of neuroticism. And what I was saying earlier about it, that there's a view that there's a trait that's anxiety, and then there's a state that's anxiety. And some people maybe have a trait, so it tends to occur consistently, and for others, it's a state that's momentary when certain events or acts take place. Okay, this lecture ends at 20 past. Half past. Okay, so I've got actually a few more minutes. Okay, so yeah, there's maybe a few causes of anxiety. You can look at them there, but it's a big issue. If you're anxious, particularly with speaking, that impacts classroom situations. It impacts interactions. So a few other findings about which I found quite interesting. Multilinguals tend to experience lower levels of language anxiety. So if you're multilingual, and part of that they were hypothesizing has to do with a greater metalinguistic awareness. So you're more aware of things above the specific language, but maybe because you have multiple languages that you can draw from, you're aware of, well, this is this in this language, and it's similar or different from this language. And maybe also more aware of why people are making mistakes, right? And then not as hard on yourself when you make mistakes. Anyway, it's a bit of an open question. This was a kind of a finding that I encountered. It's interesting to think about why that might be. I said earlier, and this is pretty much repeating that it can kind of disrupt automatic processing of your outputs. Maybe you edit too much, the monitor is too strong if you have high anxiety, and then can hinder your fluency. And then an interesting finding that I think this was from one study, but it was is that successful and active language learners, there's both a combination of both enjoyment and anxiety, both these affective factors. Obviously, enjoyment is something to do with emotion, as is anxiety, but anxiety can prompt focused action. So if you start feeling anxious, for instance, just before you start having to give a speech, that can maybe do certain things that enable you to maybe do better, also maybe do worse, but you probably have to be prepared for it. Okay, so another one is tolerance of ambiguity. It's often linked as a subcomponent of openness in the Big Five model, and it's been, like the other affective factors, viewed as a thing on its own for a long time, prior to the Big Five model becoming popular. And one of the kind of findings for this has been that if you have less anxiety, there's probably a likelihood that you have more tolerance for ambiguity. So if someone's saying things to you that you don't understand, you won't get as anxious when you're trying to process that in the moment or trying to respond to them to indicate, hey, can you please slow down? Can you recast that to me in a way that I can understand, etc. And often you need, like in a situational awareness in the moment, to actually make interactions become valuable from a language learning perspective. So less anxiety is great in that respect. So some final thoughts. Many traits seem to be based in nature, but can change with time or effort. So there's a few, like age-related change. As you get older, the N, E, and O of ocean can go down, and the A and C can go up. I won't go into that. And then big life events. So all to say that there can be changes in these traits. And a lot has to do with, I guess, big moments or experiences in life. And I guess an overall take-home is that, yeah, personality traits, when combined and in context, are a cause of major individual differences, right? So a lot of these other affective factors are really just almost the result of these things intersecting. Okay, so, but ultimately, maybe this is one final take-home: conscientiousness wins in second language learning as a personality trait, just because it predicts persistence. You could choose a really bad methodology to learn, but if you persisted it long enough, it'll work. Okay, so this is really just a repeat from yesterday. The lecture is over, but I sent out a message on Are You Connected that had quite a few details. Tomorrow we will be looking at the assignment in more detail in the lecture, and then if you have questions from that, you can ask your tutors on Friday. There's a quiz. It's based on the reading and yesterday's lecture, not today's lecture and not tomorrow's content lecture. Yeah, that's all. I hope you found it interesting and have a good Tuesday.